My project started taking shape when I ran into the concept of designer's guilt. At the start of this graduation year, I focused on understanding how materials are perceived by reading books such as Material Matters by Thomas Rau, an architect who focused on circular economy. I also visited an exhibition about the history of waste in Groningen. These things led to an awareness of the amount of materials and products people throw away. Especially within my own design practice, I realized I create a lot of leftover materials when working on a project. I chose to study product design because I love making. I've worked with materials such as wood and metal in workshops all the time, but the awareness of materials being left behind made me feel guilty about it. I tried to move on from this feeling, so I spent several months looking into the processes around waste creation and got inspired by other designers to approach making in a new way. I defined waste as something that a person has left behind due to its decreased value. And this value can be related to the usefulness and need of a material or product, as well as something that the person associates with it. Christine Meindertsma, who is a Dutch designer I'm quite inspired by, adds value to her products by telling the story and quality of them, through the material and methods in her design practice. This way of thinking inspired me not to think of the value of the product, but to investigate and develop a practice in which I add value to a leftover material. Already in the early stages of my project, I went into the workshops of Minerva and documented the different kinds of material leftovers. Especially in the wood workshop, I noticed how different kinds of tools and processes applied create different types and shapes of materials, turning my focus onto discarded wood. I think this combination of material documentation in relation to processes and the will to add value to a leftover material is what ultimately led to my final project, Left Behind. I decided to reach out to Johanna, a Dutch clog maker that had been previously introduced to me. What drew me to the process of making clogs was that the majority of the material is not actually used for the final product, but is left behind. The stages of the process create different kinds of leftover materials and clearly show the development from log to clog. My aim is to tell the story of this process from my own perspective. I want to change the narrative to focus on the left behind materials instead of the final product, thereby adding value to them. To tell the story and add value, I am creating a book to collect and reflect on the different forms of documentation and making in this project, such as photography, scanning, writing, and mapping. Erik Ketelaar, who is a Dutch archival scientist, once spoke about photography constituting an event. When I went to the workshops of the clog maker and I documented the left behind materials and the moments they were created, in a way I was able to add value through the event of photography. Another way I did that was by photographing the materials in the photo studio. There I was able to isolate each material, showcasing the variety of them. My aim was to find ways to communicate the amount of material left behind per stage in a comprehensive way as well. I did this with two different kinds of scales, weighing out each material. Scanning the material is another technique that proved to be really interesting. The scanner is only able to pick up the parts that are close to its surface, allowing me to use that quality to show particular aspects of the materials. For the smaller, leftover materials, the scans allowed a clear comparison of the individual particles in size, texture, and depth. For the clogs that I scanned in, I call them the faulty clogs, I was able to highlight parts of the wood that are faulty. The rest of the shoe that is further away from the surface is blurred out. Another form of documentation and making that became a very important part of my process are written and illustrated annotations. The handwritten annotations allowed me to add my personal observations on top of images, which is something I will show throughout all the sections of my book. The illustrated annotations allowed for new design input to be added as well. I drew proposals of new clogs over the faulty ones, virtually cutting away the bad wood that labels them as waste. Layering the illustrations in this way, however, allows me to still show the elements that make the clog unique, adding value to them. I wrote down my observations as well when I created cartopological infographical maps. Marlies Vermeulen from Deer Hunter, a cartopological research practice, first coined the term cartopology. It is a combination of cartography and anthropology and can be used to include experiences and insights into maps. In my practice, these maps are translations through text and illustrations of my observations about the movement of materials, as well as the process of creating clogs and the leftover materials. My first map of the left-behind materials was done photographically and was later annotated. Inspired by these techniques, I will create a physical three-dimensional map that you can walk through for the exhibition. I also wanted to investigate how making something out of the leftover material can increase its value. I started this by combining the left-behind wood with biological homemade binders and pressing them into blocks with an old printing press. The experiments are still in the early stages, but my aim is to continue to figure out how I can create a usable material that can benefit both Hannes, Reymann, the clog maker, as well as my own practice. I realized throughout this project that my main priority was to find a new way of working. A practice that will make me feel less guilty about making. In investigating this material's story and looking into how to communicate this new knowledge to others, I found a way that I, as a designer, can share my own perspective of a process and contribute to adding value to a left-behind material. Through this approach, I have not only found a new way of working, but also a way my designer skills can be left behind.